But the other side of its becoming, history, is a conscious, self-mediating process, spirit emptied out into time. But this externalization, this kenosis, is equally an externalization of itself. The negative is the negative of itself. This becoming presents a slow-moving succession of spirits, a gallery of images, each of which, endowed with all the riches of spirit, moves thus slowly just because the self has to penetrate and digest this entire wealth of its substance. As its fulfillment consists in perfectly knowing what it is, in knowing its substance, this knowing is its withdrawal into itself, in which it abandons its outer existence and gives its existential shape over to recollection. Thus absorbed into itself, it is sunk in the night of its self-consciousness. But in that night, its vanished outer existence is preserved. And this transformed existence, the former one, but now reborn of the Spirit's knowledge, is the new existence, a new world and a new shape of spirit. In the immediacy of this new existence, the Spirit has to start afresh, to bring itself to maturity, as if, for it, all that preceded were lost and it had learned nothing from the experience of the earlier spirits. But recollection, the inwardizing of that experience, has preserved it and is the inner being and, in fact, the higher form of the substance. So, although this spirit starts afresh and apparently from its own resources to bring itself to maturity, it is nonetheless on a higher level that it starts. The realm of spirits which is formed in this way in the outer world constitutes a succession in time in which one spirit relieved another of its charge and each took over the empire of the world from its predecessor. The goal is the revelation of the depth of spirit, and this is the absolute notion. This revelation is therefore the raising up of its depth or its extension, the negativity of this withdrawn I, a negativity which is its externalization or its substance. And this revelation is also the notion's time, in that this externalization is in its own self externalized, and just as it is in its extension, so it is equally in its depth in the self. The goal, absolute knowing, or spirit that knows itself as spirit, has for its path the recollection of the spirits as they are in themselves and as they accomplish the organization of their realm. Their preservation, regarded from the side of their free existence appearing in the form of contingency, is history, but regarded from the side of their philosophically comprehended organization, it is the science of knowing in the sphere of appearance. The two together, comprehended history, form alike the inwardizing and the Calvary of absolute spirit, the actuality, truth, and certainty of his throne, without which he would be lifeless and alone. Only from the chalice of this realm of spirits foams forth for him his own infinitude. With paragraph 808 and the final sentences in it, this beautiful set of lines, from the chalice of this realm of spirits foams forth for him his own infinitude, we finish Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, and we're ready, supposedly, to move on to other things. Although this is the kind of work, I think many of you know this, that rewards rereadings. So where should you go after this? Maybe start at the beginning. Again, I don't know how many times I've read this book through myself, and perhaps that would be a good idea for anybody who is following along, because things will get richer, to use a term that comes up in a number of places in this paragraph. So this is the culmination. We are getting to the point of comprehended history, begriffene Geschichte, and we are finally knowing, ideally, what exactly absolute knowing is. And here Hegel is going to use a really important term. Miller translates it as recollection. I think that's a great way to do it. Erinnerung, right? And it's going to show up at different places in this paragraph, and it is recollection not just of spirit, this is spirit knowing itself, but of spirits, plural. And we've talked about this in the previous paragraphs. There are shapes, Gestalt, right? A Gestalten, plural, of consciousness. And in the last several paragraphs, Hegel has talked about these in terms of shapes of spirit itself. And that is what we have been traversing throughout this. And absolute knowing itself is also a final Gestalt, a final shape, a condition of spirit, of Geist, mind, whatever you want to call it. Now, I do have to point out that Miller takes a few liberties in translation that we'll point out in here. I try not to beat up on him too much because as a translator, I know how difficult it is to render things well from one language to another. And I do know the temptation of wanting to, steer your translation in a certain direction. But I also want you to be aware of what Hegel himself is saying and what Miller is saying that Hegel's saying. So let's start at the very beginning. We've talked about becoming, werden, right? And a couple different sides to it, a couple different aspects to it. And then he says, here's the next side to it. The other side of its becoming, werden, history, Geschichte, is a conscious knowing, right? A knowing self-mediating. So this is important. We were talking about the immediate before. Now we were realizing how mediated everything is. And it's not just mediated in terms of factors that we had to dig up through, studying things and thinking about them. It's self-mediating. And Hegel's going to, resort to some, what we could call at this point, almost tropes. But we're not supposed to just view them as tropes about how it is self-mediating. So he calls this a self-mediating process. Now, process is actually werden again. So becoming, process, those are the same terms. That's the first thing that I want to point out to you about Miller's translation. This becoming history is a becoming spirit. Now here we get to the next thing. Emptied out into time, but this externalization. So, and äußern and Äußerung gets used a lot in this paragraph. And Miller is going to, instead of using one term like externalization, he's going to translate it in a variety of ways that might give you the idea that we're using different terminology here. So spirit emptied and externalized into time. This externalization, this kenosis, there's no kenosis in the actual text, is equally an externalization of itself. Well, of course it's an externalization of itself. It is doing the externalizing. And what is it externalizing? What is it, putting outside of itself? Itself, as we saw, again, in previous paragraphs. So thus far, other than, bringing history in very implicitly, he's not saying something radically different. And then he tells us it's the negative is the negative of itself. Let's dwell on that for a moment. One thing that people, when they're first explaining Hegel to an audience that perhaps doesn't know that much about it, they will bring up the role of negation in Hegel, and they will talk about determinate negation, right, where you have a first negation and then a negation of the negation, and you don't simply, it's not like minus and minus turn into plus. It's rather that minus turns into something that's plus, something that's positive, but it's not the same one that you started with. Things become more complicated, more mediated, more explicitly connected, related to each other in the process of negating them, right? So this should be familiar to all of us by this point, I hope, but it's worth mentioning. So then he goes back to talking about this becoming. This becoming presents a slow-moving succession of spirits, a ordering in time, we could say, as we're going to look at in a moment. And then he's got this interesting metaphor, which is itself quite visual, right? A gallery of images, of, Bilder. Is this a reversion back to representation or picture thinking? No, it's not. But we look at what has been going on through the history that we've been working our way through in the phenomenology, and that's a history of shapes of consciousness, but you can also call it a history of spirits, plural. And here he reminds us of some very important points. So he tells us each of these images, endowed with all the riches, Reichtum. So Reich and Reichtum are both going to be used in this quite a lot, and there's, of course, a very close continuity between them. So when we see, for example, the realm, the Reich, that is where the Reichtum, the wealth, can be found, can occur, can develop, can be mined, we might even say. So each of which endowed with all the riches of spirit. So each of the stages that we went through previously in the phenomenology was, at least from the vantage point of that stage, for a little while before its inadequacy and its need to be surpassed was understood. Its negation was understood. Each of them was endowed with all the riches of spirit up to that point. People lived not an impoverished life, but a rich life at that stage, and experienced the fullness of that stage. They just didn't realize that there was more than that. Or maybe they did, and it was presented to them in a negation. Maybe we need to go further with this, and that's what the dialectical process has been this entire time. Now, why can't we just run our way through it? People, this is a bit of a side note, sometimes people are like, I'm going to speed run through Hegel, right? That's a terrible idea. You're not going to understand anything if you do that. It's hard enough just going through at a normal, thoughtful, attentive pace and getting everything that Hegel's saying the first time that you read it through, or the 10th time that you read it through. You should not be trying to watch these things at 1.25 or 2.0 speed. That's a stupid move. I mean, you can say that about most philosophy, that you really need to linger over it. As a matter of fact, even when it comes to literature or history, you don't want to be trying to cut corners. You don't want to try to speed up the process. You got to linger through it. Now, Hegel tells you why. Why is that? He says that the self has to penetrate and digest this entire wealth, again, Reichtum, of its substance. So, this is a good thing to remember. And then he goes on and he talks about fulfilment, right? And these terms like fulfillment and perfection, they're all composites using the prefix full, right? To bring something to its fullness, to bring something to its fully developed state, to its end. So perfection doesn't mean immaculate in the sense of like having no flaws or anything like that, or being frozen in glass forever. It means being brought to a stage where there's nothing left to add to it, but you've got this dynamic, living, complex living both in itself and in us. And so he goes on and he says, as its fulfillment consists in perfectly knowing what it is, in knowing its substance, this knowing is its withdrawal into itself. It's insichgein. We've seen this term used a lot in the religion section and the absolute knowing section. Withdrawal into itself in which it abandons. Now, Hegel doesn't use the term outer existence. He just says Dasein. So it abandons its outer existence is what Miller is saying. It just abandons its existence and gives its existential shape over to recollection, to Erinnerung, right? Now, what is its existential shape? It's spirit. So it's, Gestalt. What it is that existence, the being there, being in the world, Dasein, right? What is its form? What is its structure? What is its type of consciousness? So he goes on, and now here he brings up self-consciousness. Thus absorbed into itself, it is sunk in the night of its self-consciousness, but in that night, its vanished outer existence. Again, Hegel's not using the word outer there. He's just saying Dasein, but this is a Dasein that is disappearing, a Dasein that is vanishing, right? And that is being turned into or replaced by something. Its vanished outer existence gets preserved, and this transformed existence is the new existence, right? The transformed existence is actually an existence that is being aufgehobenes. It's preserving stuff. Aufheben, another key Hegelian term. Aufheben means to not just surpass and leave behind, but to bring with you and integrate what was essential, what was most fully developed from the previous position. This is how negation takes place in Hegelian dialectic, right? So what is going on here? Transformed existence, the former one, the existence that it was before, but now reborn of the Spirit's knowledge. And here, now notice these terms that he's using. And notice, too, that Hegel does bring these together in threes at several points in this final paragraph. And it's not the three of, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, that silly BS that isn't really Hegel, that you see on the internet and bad history of philosophy people summarizing Hegel. It's rather a triad of what we're talking about, what the thing is. The new existence, right? So a new Dasein, a new world, new neues Welt, and a new shape of spirit. Gestalt des Geistes, right? Shape of spirit, shape of consciousness. Now why is it a shape of spirit? Because spirit is what we've been doing this entire time. We have been spirit all along. So a new shape of spirit that is also at the same time a world. So it's not just the self. It's all the things the self is surrounded by and engages with. And it is existence in that world. It is Dasein in that new world. Now, it's not new as in, again, everything, we leave everything else behind, we're on to a new stage, screw all that other stuff, throw the book away, we're on to a better thing. No, it's incorporating all of that and keeping the riches, or if you like, the realm of all these previous shapes of spirit in your back pocket, ready to use when you want to, ready to recall to mind. So we've gotten about halfway through the paragraph now. What's going on? In this immediacy of this new existence, spirit has to start afresh to bring itself to maturity, as if for it all that preceded were lost and it had learned nothing from the experience, what it is the previous spirits, the previous stages, had gone through. It might seem that way to you. Is that really the case? Hegel is saying, no, that isn't the case, because what does he say in the very next line? Recollection, the inwardizing of that experience, what the previous shapes of consciousness. And if we want to think about this historically, the previous people have gone through and passed on to us, whether in writing, for example, in the history of philosophy, which Hegel explores. He has lectures on that, right, where he's going to say, here's what Plato was giving to us, and it's coming out of Plato's text. Here's what Aristotle was doing. Now, of course, his history, when it comes to Hellenistic philosophy, maybe not quite so good. Don't worry about that at this point, right? Or it could be in action. It could be in deeds. It could be in social organization. It could be in reflection on practical affairs. All of those things are the provinces of previous spirits that the spirit of the present can recollect. So recollection is in part what we've been doing in this. Certainly in the self-consciousness section, maybe the master-slave dialectic is mythical, but Stoicism, skepticism, and the unhappy consciousness, which are the larger section in that work, those aren't mythical. Those are supposed to be previous shapes of consciousness that we went through. Likewise, all the things that we found in the reason section, all the things that we found in the spirit section, all the things that we found in the religion section are supposed to be what human beings as lowercase s spirits within the uppercase s spirit of that particular time, culture, dynamic, what they experienced, what they went through, what they attained, but didn't quite finish with, right? So in this immediacy, it's start afresh, right? Recollection, the inwardizing of the experience, has preserved it and is the inner being, and in fact, the higher form of the substance. Not a surprise that Hegel thinks that where we are now, the end of the book, the final viewpoint is a better one, right? And here's where we start getting into the things that I've got sort of diagrammed on the board. So he says, although this spirit starts afresh and apparently from its own resources to bring itself to maturity, it is nonetheless on a higher level that it starts. So we've got a sort of bifurcated existence or viewpoint, we could say. The realm of spirits, which is formed in this way in the outer world, constitutes a succession in time in which one spirit relieved another of its charge, and each took over this is a beautiful phrase, the empire of the world, the ruling of the world, the determination of the world from its predecessor. So, maybe for a while we were into the master-slave dialectic, and could happen again, right? Barbarism occurs. And then from that, we move into a new shape of consciousness in the self-consciousness section, Stoicism. Stoicism arises, according to Hegel, and many other thinkers as well, who, by the way, are kind of getting this wrong. It arises when we realize a kind of universal slavery or bondage, and we've lost the original, Greek city-state. Everybody knows everybody sort of context. Don't worry about whether that's true or not. For Hegel, what he's saying is, once you've got Stoicism on the scene, it has taken over from the master-slave dialectic, right? What was important in that has been transported into a new shape of consciousness. And then skepticism will take over from Stoicism as Stoicism fails as a new shape of consciousness or shape of spirit. And then skepticism isn't the final word either, because the unhappy consciousness, the longest section in the self-consciousness section, will take over again, right? And then we'll move into an entirely different section with reason, and then spirit, and then religion, and then finally absolute knowing. So each of these stages that we have gone through in this text has been taking us from one shape of consciousness which didn't think of itself as finished into another which is like, you are finished, buddy. Let me do the work now, and you just take it easy there, Grandpa, old man, right? So what is the goal of this? The goal is the revelation, the Offenbarung, the revelation to us of the depth of spirit, and this is the absolute notion, the absolute begriff, the absolute concept, which is what we get in absolute knowing. And so he goes on and he says this revelation is the raising up of its depth, right? So we have a revelation of the depths of spirit. We need to plumb those depths and bring things out. Or an extension, or its extension, the negativity of this withdrawn I, an I that withdraws itself, a negativity which is, notice the term we're coming back to here, the externalization, is its externalization or its substance. And then he says something else. This revelation, this Offenbarung, this showing us something, is also the notion's time. Right? So it is the concepts, the begriffs, time. Now, why is he talking about revelation here? Didn't we leave that behind with religion, the revealed religion, Christianity? Well, I mean, one way you could think about this is you can't force revelation. And, what do we typically oppose to revelation? Reason, rationality, right? And you can say, well, we can develop everything that we need. We don't need a revelation from some sort of divine. And the revelation here isn't from a divine who is separate and higher than us. It is a revelation to ourselves of what spirit can actually be in absolute knowing. So it's a revelation, it's a self-revelation. But it is nonetheless a revelation. It has to happen when the time, the Zeit, is actually ripe. When it's full, right? When it has been brought to its perfection or its fulfillment. Which can't happen in the previous stages, even though they wanted it to happen in the previous stages. It's got to happen, according to Hegel, here at the end of history. So he goes on and he says, this revelation is the notion's time, in that this externalization is in its own self externalized, and just as it is in its extension, so it is equally in its depth, in the self, in its, not just in how it's extended, numerically, but in, we could say, its quality or its intensity, its complexity. Here he says the goal, Ziel, is absolute knowing, or spirit that knows itself as spirit, a formulation that we've encountered already in the previous paragraphs. Spirit is getting to know what spirit truly is. It already did that to some extent, but here it's finished. It has been brought to its fruition. And what does that mean? Spirit that knows itself as spirit, or absolute knowing, has for its path the recollection of the spirits, all the previous spirits. How? Well, he tells us the spirits as they are in themselves and as they accomplish the organization of their realm, their Reich, their riches, their place. This is going to lead us to two complementary ways of looking at things that we have already seen come up in the previous paragraphs, not least the paragraph just preceding this, right? And this is where we're going to get to the end. So he tells us their preservation regarded from one side. What side? The side of free existence. So freedom, existence, Dasein, is appearing in the form of contingency, right? Contingency, Zufälligkeit, things could be different than they are. So, did the master and slave have to do things the way that they did? No. Did Stoicism have to emerge necessarily? Just showed up on the scene. As we know, actually Epicureanism preceded it, as did Cynicism. But, in Hegel's schema, we're not going to worry about those so much, at least in the Phenomenology. So it seems like history is a bunch of contingencies. This war is fought. This development takes place. Some new doctrine is worked out by this guy over here. A printing press is designed and books start getting published, no longer copied out by monks or scribes, but, in printing presses. And, it's all just kind of random stuff that happens. It's not completely, of course, as we know. History is not just like one damn thing after another, as some people like to say. It's not just a bunch of trivia either. Understanding history, again, a bit of an aside. There's a lot of people who call themselves history buffs, and they don't know a damn thing about history because what they lack is how things are actually connected together. They're like, yeah, this thing happened, and that thing happened, and this thing happened, and I've got them all memorized up here. But that's just trivia. It's like memorizing baseball statistics. You got to actually know how the game is played. You got to know what it all means and what the individual parts mean. Okay, digression over. So, free existence appearing in the form of contingency, that is history, but we can look at it in another way. We can talk about it as the side of their, and Miller is interpolating here philosophically, but that's fine, comprehended organization, right? Begriffene Organisation. Hegel actually uses the Latinate word there that we just translate as the cognate. So we can look at things in two ways. We can look at the succession of spirits in time. We can look at the organization of them, and we get two different things. We get history, or we get the science of knowing in the sphere of appearance, which is not exactly what Hegel says. Science, Wissenschaft, der erscheinenden Wissens, right? So the science of, if we want to be a little bit more literal, of appearing knowledge, of knowledge that displays itself, that emerges through appearing to us, showing itself to us, erscheinende, right? So, we could say, okay, over here we've got, history. Over here we have Wissenschaft, science, an understanding of it. And they're both complementary viewpoints on this entire process. Now, there's actually an interesting footnote here. Miller is going to say science of knowing in the sphere of appearance is phenomenology, the very phenomenology of spirit. Is it? Isn't it? That's kind of a bold interpretive move here that I think we have to be a little bit leery of. Now, what's really important, we've got these two sides. They're united. Together, right? Die beide, bringing them together, they form, bilden, or actually not bilden, but bestehen, right? They constitute they together are what he calls comprehended history, begriffene Geschichte. So it's not like we had history and then we have like history's explanation over here. This is all history, but it's conceived, conceptual history. History in the concept, the kind of history that Hegel takes himself as doing in his other works. And he tells us some stuff about this. It's an inwardizing. Now, inwardizing is a weird way to translate Erinnerung, recollection. It's a recollection. And Calvary, Schadelstatte, right? Okay, so that's kind of some, nice metaphorical language there of absolute spirit. And then he says something I think even more important. So here's another triad, right? What is this? The actuality, the truth, and the certainty of his throne, spirit's throne, knowing's throne, our throne, as the person understanding these things, engaging in comprehended history. Now, where have we seen these terms before? So, truth and certainty. There's been this constant back and forth, right? We start with certainty, and then we realize, well, we're not quite so certain, so we try to reach out for truth, Wahrheit. We say, what is the truth of this thing that we take as being certain? And we gain the truth, but we lose the certainty in the process, and then we're like, oh, crap, we need to get certain. How do we know that this truth is actually truth? Or can we be certain of it? And then we move back to certainty, and we want to have things that are true and certain. We want truth and certainty together. But we don't want just a mere idealism stuck in our little heads. We want actuality, a term that we, again, have seen so many times here in the Phenomenology, playing such a massive role. Hegel is about getting to actuality, not just making castles in the sky or nice conceptual schemas. He wants to cognize, to conceptualize, to exist within, to change the world in which we are at the end of this dialectical process. So the dialectical process, it finishes itself up through a new world, a new existence, a new actuality that encompasses truth and certainty for us. And then this leads us, we have to have this actuality, truth, and certainty of his throne, without which he would be lifeless and alone. And here we get the final line. Only from the chalice of this realm of spirits foams forth for him his own infinitude. This is the infinite brought into our reality, there for us. And so with this, we bring Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, our study of it, our commentary on it, to what I hope for you seems like a successful close. I won't say necessarily termination, because, as I pointed out, you may want to go back and reread. You may want to devote additional study to this work. But as far as this work on our part of trying to figure out what the hell is Hegel actually saying, we are now finished. And I hope that you have found these commentaries useful for not only helping you understand what Hegel himself is saying in this quite difficult text, but that you've enjoyed this. You've found it interesting. You have allowed it to permeate your own life and thinking, and made it part of who you are, and perhaps even been perplexed enough to wonder whether Hegel actually got all this stuff right or not. So on that, we finish up, and happy hunting through Hegel's Phenomenology on your part throughout however long these commentaries last.